Prattville, Alabama, was the kind of town where people left their doors unlocked at night and greeted their neighbors with a nod. It wasn't the kind of place where people vanished without a trace, but on that particular night, something felt different. The house on Willow Creek Road was dark, except for the flickering glow of a television. The curtains were drawn, and from the outside, everything seemed normal. Inside, Summer Tatum, 26 years old and 5 months pregnant, should have been home, resting. She had plans earlier that evening, a dinner with her best friend, but she never showed up. Lauren Adams had been waiting for her. At first, she thought Summer had just lost track of time. But as the hours passed, worry began to creep in. She sent a text, then another. The response she finally received was brief, almost too abrupt. "Not feeling well, maybe another time." Something about it felt off. Summer had been excited about the dinner just that afternoon, chatting about what she might order, what she would wear. It wasn't like her to cancel plans so suddenly. Lauren considered calling, but something held her back. Maybe Summer really was just tired. Pregnancy could be exhausting, and she didn't want to be the friend who overreacted. Still, the unease didn't leave her. Across town, Hunter James Tatum, Summer's husband, told anyone who asked that his wife had stepped out for a while, maybe for some air, maybe to clear her head. He didn't seem worried. He said she would be back soon. But there was one problem. Summer's car was still in the driveway. Her phone was turned off. The night air carried the sounds of crickets chirping and the occasional rustling of leaves. But one neighbor, Mrs. Parker, had heard something else. It had been late, maybe close to midnight. At first, it was just muffled voices raised in what sounded like an argument. That wasn't so unusual. Married couples fought. But then there had been a sharp, loud sound. A single, heavy noise, like something falling or something else. After that, silence. Mrs. Parker had peered out of her kitchen window, expecting to see something unusual. But the Tatum house was still, its windows dark. Maybe it had been nothing. Maybe she had imagined it. She thought about calling someone but decided against it. It was probably just the television or a slammed door. She told herself she was being foolish. She went back to bed. Morning came, and Summer was still nowhere to be found. Lauren called again. No answer. Then she tried Hunter. This time he picked up. His voice was even, controlled. When she asked about Summer, he didn't hesitate. "She's probably at her mom's or something. You know how she is. Sometimes she just needs space." But that didn't make sense. Lauren knew Summer. If she had gone to her mother's house, she would have said something, and she wouldn't have left her car, or her purse, or her phone. By noon, Diane, Summer's mother, was on her way over. She pulled into the driveway and knocked on the door. No answer. She knocked again. Nothing. She called Hunter's phone, and after a long moment, he finally opened the door. His face was unreadable, his eyes heavy. "Where is she?" Diane asked immediately. Hunter rubbed his temples. He looked tired, like a man who hadn't slept. "She left late last night. I don't know where she went." Diane stepped inside, pushing past him without waiting for permission. Something felt wrong the moment she entered. The air smelled off, not strong but faintly, unmistakably, like bleach. She scanned the room. The kitchen counter was clean, almost too clean. But what caught her attention was Summer's purse sitting untouched by the door, her keys right next to it. Her stomach twisted. "Hunter," she said slowly, keeping her voice level. "If she left, why is all of her stuff still here?" Hunter opened his mouth as if to answer, but then closed it again. Across the street, Mrs. Parker watched everything unfold from her window. She saw Diane pacing outside, phone pressed against her ear, her expression shifting from frustration to something darker. She saw Hunter standing stiffly in the doorway, arms crossed, barely speaking. The feeling she had the night before returned, stronger this time. She hesitated for only a moment before picking up her phone. She called the police. The call to the police was brief, almost hesitant. Mrs. Parker wasn't even sure how to explain what she had seen, or rather, what she hadn't seen. A missing woman, a house that seemed too quiet, and a mother standing outside looking like she had just realized something was terribly wrong. It wasn't exactly an emergency, not yet, but the dispatcher promised to send an officer to check things out. By the time a patrol car pulled up in front of the Tatum house, Diane was still standing on the porch, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her jaw set. The officer who stepped out of the car, Officer Reynolds, recognized her immediately. Small towns were like that. He had known Summer since she was a teenager, had seen her grow up, get married, and settle down. Diane didn't waste any time. She told him everything. The unanswered calls, the abandoned car, the untouched purse and keys, the text message that didn't sound like her daughter, and most of all, the feeling she couldn't shake. The officer listened carefully, nodding in all the right places, but his expression remained neutral. Women left home sometimes. They got overwhelmed, especially when they were pregnant. Maybe she had just needed a break. But when Reynolds knocked on the door and Hunter answered, something in his demeanor shifted. Hunter looked exhausted, his face pale, his eyes shadowed. He leaned against the doorframe, blinking like he had just woken up. The house behind him was dark, the curtains still drawn. He asked what this was about, his voice low, his words careful. Reynolds explained the situation, phrasing it gently. Not an accusation, but a routine welfare check. Hunter didn't seem surprised. He said he understood why people were worried, but he didn't seem worried himself. He repeated what he had told Diane. Summer had left late the previous night. He hadn't seen or heard from her since. He said he assumed she would come back when she was ready. Reynolds asked if he could come inside just to take a look. A pause, just long enough to be noticeable. Then Hunter stepped aside. The house was quiet, still carrying that faint scent of bleach that Diane had noticed earlier. The air inside felt stale, like the windows hadn't been opened in days. The living room was neat, almost too neat. The television was still on, muted, playing some late-night rerun. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. But something about the place felt wrong. It felt staged. Reynolds made his way through the house, his eyes scanning the floor, the walls, the furniture. He wasn't expecting to find bloodstains or anything obvious, but he was looking for something, anything, that felt out of place. His gaze landed on a single spot on the carpet near the hallway. It looked clean, but there was a slight discoloration, barely visible unless you were looking for it. He frowned. He asked Hunter if he had any idea where Summer might have gone. Hunter shrugged, said she hadn't told him. He seemed calm, but there was a stiffness to the way he stood, an unnatural stillness in his movements. Then there was the matter of Summer's belongings. Her purse, her keys, her phone. It didn't add up. If she had left on her own, why would she leave everything behind? How had she left the house if her car was still parked outside? Reynolds didn't push the questions too hard. Not yet. He thanked Hunter for his time and stepped back outside, where Diane was waiting, her arms still crossed, her jaw still clenched. He told her what she already knew. Something wasn't right. By the time the officer returned to his car, he had already decided to file a missing persons report. It was a formality for now. There was no sign of foul play, no concrete reason to assume anything had happened to Summer. But the report would at least get the wheels turning, make it official. Back at the station, he made a few calls. First to Summer's workplace. They hadn't seen her, hadn't heard from her. She hadn't called in sick. She had simply disappeared. Then to a few of her friends. The story was always the same. No one had seen or spoken to her since the previous afternoon. No one had any idea where she might have gone. Lauren, the best friend, was the most adamant. She told him about the text message, the way it didn't sound like Summer. She told him that Summer had been looking forward to their dinner, that she wouldn't have just canceled like that. And then she said something that made him stop. Summer had told her something was wrong. She hadn't gone into detail, hadn't explained, but she had been uneasy, nervous. She had brushed it off when Lauren asked about it, said it was nothing, but now it didn't feel like nothing. Reynolds added it to his notes. That night as he drove home, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were already running out of time. The missing persons report had barely been filed when whispers of unease began spreading through town. In a place like Prattville, people noticed when something felt off, and Summer Tatum's disappearance was more than just another case of someone skipping town. She wasn't the type to leave without a word. She had a routine, a life, a baby on the way. And yet no one had seen her. At the police station, Officer Reynolds sat at his desk, combing through the initial statements. It was still early in the investigation, but something wasn't adding up. The way Hunter had answered the door, the way the house felt too clean, the purse and car left behind, a series of small inconsistencies, each one insignificant on its own, but together they formed the first cracks in what should have been a simple explanation. Reynolds started with the basics. He pulled up Summer's phone records. The last outgoing message was the text to Lauren. Not feeling well. Maybe another time. A short, almost dismissive message, and yet it was the first real anomaly. Lauren was certain it didn't sound like her friend, and the longer Reynolds looked at it, the more he agreed. The last call from Summer's phone had been placed to Hunter's number at 10:42 p.m. the night before she vanished. After that, nothing. No outgoing calls, no texts, no activity on social media. It was as if she had ceased to exist the moment that message was sent. But then there was something else. Her phone had stopped pinging cell towers at 2:13 a.m. It hadn't just been turned off. It had either been destroyed or manually powered down. That alone wasn't proof of anything, but it was unusual. Most people didn't turn their phones off in the middle of the night, especially pregnant women who might need it in case of an emergency. Hunter had said Summer left late. If that were true, where had she gone without her phone, without her car? And why would she have turned off her only means of communication? Reynolds requested security footage from any nearby houses that had cameras facing the street. In a neighborhood like this, most homes didn't have surveillance systems, but there were always exceptions. He made calls, checked with homeowners. By the afternoon, a local resident, a few doors down, had provided footage from their front porch camera. Reynolds watched the grainy video carefully. It wasn't much, just a narrow view of the street, mostly empty for hours at a time. But then, at 3:07 a.m., a figure appeared at the edge of the frame. A man, tall, moving quickly. He was carrying something, but it was hard to make out in the darkness. The only clear thing was that he was heading toward the Tatum house. 36 minutes later, the same figure reappeared. This time, he was walking in the opposite direction, toward the driveway. He was moving slower now, and the object in his hands was gone. There was no way to make out a face, but the build, the movement. It was a near-perfect match for Hunter Tatum. Reynolds exhaled slowly, watching the footage again and again, his mind racing through the implications. If Summer had left the house on her own, she wasn't on this footage. If she had walked out that door, she had done so without passing the cameras, without taking her car, without anyone seeing her. That didn't happen by accident. Meanwhile, back at the house, Diane Tatum wasn't waiting for the police to come back with answers. She had spent the morning making calls, to Summer's co-workers, to her friends, to anyone who might have seen her daughter. No one had. The more she searched for answers, the more certain she became that something was very, very wrong. She returned to the house around noon. This time she didn't knock. She opened the door and stepped inside. Hunter was in the living room, sitting on the couch, his hands clasped between his knees. His face was drawn, tired, but there was something else in his expression. He looked at her, but he didn't say anything. Diane's eyes moved over the room. The television was on, but muted. The coffee table was spotless, almost unnaturally clean. It was the same feeling Officer Reynolds had picked up on earlier, the sense that someone had wiped everything down, not just to clean, but to erase. And then she noticed the laundry, a neatly folded stack of clothes sitting on the arm of the couch. On top, a light blue shirt that belonged to Summer. It was perfectly clean. No stains, no wrinkles. Something about that shirt made her heart tighten in her chest. Summer hated folding laundry. She would have left it in a pile on the bed, draped over a chair. Anything but this neat, deliberate arrangement. Diane reached for the shirt. When she picked it up, she felt it immediately. It was damp, not freshly washed, damp like it had been scrubbed. She set it down, her hands suddenly shaking. Hunter was still watching her, still saying nothing. She turned, walked back out the door, and called the police again. By that evening, the case was no longer just a missing persons report. It was something else. And for the first time, Officer Reynolds was sure of one thing. Summer Tatum hadn't left that house on her own. The second call from Diane Tatum changed everything. A missing persons report was one thing. People disappeared, sometimes for innocent reasons, sometimes for complicated ones. But the moment she mentioned the damp scrubbed shirt, the stack of too clean laundry, and the growing certainty in her voice that her daughter hadn't simply walked away, the case took on a different weight. By the time Officer Reynolds returned to the Tatum house that evening, it was clear that this was no longer just a matter of a woman who needed space. The inconsistencies were adding up too quickly. No signs of Summer at work, no signs of her reaching out to friends, no confirmed sightings beyond what Hunter claimed, and even his account felt paper thin under scrutiny. The security footage showing a figure moving through the night, the phone that had gone silent at 2:13 a.m., and now the unsettling image of Summer's clothes, freshly cleaned, waiting in a neat pile like a scene deliberately arranged to look normal. It was all beginning to form a shape, the kind of shape that made seasoned officers shift uncomfortably in their seats because they had seen it before. When Reynolds knocked on the door, Hunter answered just as he had before, but this time, there was something different in his posture. He wasn't leaning casually against the doorframe, wasn't feigning confusion. His hands were in his pockets, his shoulders tense, his eyes scanning Reynolds' face like he was trying to read just how much the officer knew. Reynolds had been doing this job long enough to recognize when someone was bracing themselves. Inside, the house was the same as before. Clean, almost staged, as if someone had gone through the motions of maintaining normalcy without actually living in it. The television was still on, playing some show no one was watching. The laundry was still folded on the couch. The air was still carrying that faint, unmistakable scent of bleach, barely noticeable, but impossible to ignore once detected. Reynolds started simple. He asked again about the last time Hunter saw Summer, and Hunter gave the same answer, word for word as if rehearsed. She had left late. She hadn't said where she was going. He assumed she would be back. His voice was steady, but his hands, tucked deep into his pockets, were twitching slightly, like they wanted to do something. Clench, fidget, maybe reach for a cigarette or a drink. Anything to occupy the space between words. Then Reynolds asked about the laundry. Hunter blinked, caught off guard for the first time. Reynolds didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The question hung there, simple but weighted, and for a second too long, Hunter said nothing. Then finally a shrug. Summer had done it before she left, he said. It was an answer, just not a good one. Reynolds nodded as if satisfied, but he wasn't. He asked if he could take a quick look around, just a routine check, and Hunter hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping aside. The officer moved slowly, taking his time, scanning the house with the quiet attention of someone looking for something out of place. He didn't expect to find anything obvious. If there was anything to find, Hunter had likely taken precautions. But small details mattered. They built a case in ways people never anticipated. The kitchen was spotless. The counters wiped down. No dishes in the sink. No stray crumbs on the table. But then, near the garbage bin, something small and insignificant caught his eye. Just a speck, really. Almost nothing at all. A tiny, dark red smear against the baseboard. Barely the size of a fingernail. It could have been anything. A drop of sauce, old food, paint. But something about it made Reynolds stop. He didn't say anything. Not yet. He just made a note of it. He continued into the bedroom, where everything was in its place. Neatly made bed, nothing out of order. But on the nightstand, there was a picture frame, face down. He picked it up. It was a photo of Hunter and Summer, smiling, arms wrapped around each other. There was no dust on the surface where it had been lying, meaning it had been turned over recently. Then there was the closet. Reynolds scanned the floor. Most of Summer's shoes were still there, lined up neatly, but something was missing. The suitcase. Every woman he knew had at least one small bag, the kind they used for overnight stays or quick trips. If Summer had really left on her own, she would have packed something. But there was no sign of any missing clothes, no gaps in the row of neatly hung dresses. She hadn't packed. She hadn't left. Reynolds stepped back into the living room, took another glance at Hunter, and saw it again. That slight shift in his stance, the way his fingers tapped nervously in his pockets, the tightness around his jaw. The wrong answer to a question that hadn't even been asked yet. Outside, as Reynolds stepped off the porch, Diane was waiting. She looked at him, and he didn't have to say a word. She saw the answer in his face. That night, the investigation changed. Summer Tatum wasn't missing. She was gone. And the last person to see her alive was standing in that house. The shift in the investigation wasn't announced with flashing lights or a dramatic confrontation. It happened in quiet moments, in the way Officer Reynolds wrote his notes more deliberately, in the way he no longer considered this a search for a missing woman, but something else entirely. He drove back to the station that night with the image of Hunter Tatum still burned into his mind. Standing in that too-clean living room, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, answering questions with the kind of careful precision that only came from someone who had rehearsed their lines in advance. It was the smallest things that spoke the loudest. The purse by the door, the keys left behind, the phone that had gone silent in the middle of the night, the laundry folded too neatly, the missing suitcase, a house that smelled like bleach but carried the weight of something unseen. Reynolds sat at his desk, flipping through the case file, but his mind was already moving ahead. They needed more. They needed hard evidence. Circumstantial clues and a bad feeling weren't enough to take a man into custody. But gut instinct was something honed over years in the field, and his told him they weren't looking for a woman who had walked away. They were looking for a woman who had never left at all. By morning, additional officers had been assigned to the case. It was no longer just Reynolds making quiet observations and filing reports. The investigation was expanding, moving past casual interviews and into something deeper. Detectives were brought in, forensic teams were alerted. A judge signed off on a search warrant for the Tatum residence, granting investigators access to more than just what Hunter had allowed them to see. When they returned to the house, Hunter didn't look surprised. He stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, as officers moved past him, opening cabinets, checking drains, pulling up rugs. He didn't protest, didn't ask questions, just watched. His silence felt like confirmation. The forensic team moved methodically, swabbing surfaces, checking for traces of blood that couldn't be seen with the naked eye. They worked in the bathroom, in the kitchen, in the bedroom where Summer's clothes still hung untouched. They ran luminol over the floor, over the walls, over the spot near the baseboard where Reynolds had noticed the tiny smear the night before. The chemical reaction was instant. The glow spread in uneven patches, faint but undeniable. Someone had tried to clean, but they hadn't been thorough enough. In the bedroom, they lifted the mattress, examined the carpet underneath. More traces, faint but present. Blood had soaked through the fabric, not enough for a violent struggle, but enough to tell a story, one where something had happened in that room, something that wasn't supposed to. The search extended outside. A cadaver dog was brought in, sniffing through the yard, the driveway, the garage. The animal circled, nose to the ground, alert, following an invisible trail only it could detect. Near the back of the house by the shed, it stopped. Saturday, the signal. Investigators focused on that area, digging, searching. They found nothing immediately, but that didn't mean nothing had been there. Meanwhile, detectives focused on Hunter. They requested his phone records, tracking his calls and messages in the hours before and after Summer's disappearance. What they found was another break in the pattern. At 3:12 a.m., Hunter had made a single outgoing call to a number that wasn't saved in his contacts, a number registered to a prepaid burner phone. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. Reynolds stared at the report. A man who claimed to have no idea where his wife had gone had made a secret call in the middle of the night to a disposable phone, a phone that couldn't be traced. They needed to know who had answered that call. At the same time, another discovery surfaced. Investigators had pulled Summer's financial records, looking for any sign of recent activity. There was none. No transactions, no withdrawals, no attempts to use her credit cards. But there was one thing that stood out: an online search history retrieved from her personal computer, showing that she had been looking at plane tickets just days before she vanished. Had she been planning to leave? Had she known something was coming? Or had someone else used her computer to plant a false lead? And then there was another search. A name. Lucy Gardner. Reynolds didn't recognize it at first, but when he ran it through the system, it came back linked to an address in London, England. And then another connection appeared. An online gaming profile. linked directly to Hunter Tatum. The case had just taken another turn. This wasn't just a troubled marriage. This wasn't just a disappearance. There was someone else in the equation, someone who wasn't in Prattville at all. Reynolds sat back, exhaling slowly. The pieces were falling into place, and Hunter was running out of places to hide. The discovery of Lucy Gardner's name in Summer Tatum's search history sent a ripple through the investigation. Until now, the case had revolved around a missing woman, a husband with too many inconsistencies, and a house that seemed to be hiding something beneath its meticulously cleaned surfaces. But this was different. This was a thread leading outside of Prattville, outside of Alabama, across the ocean to a woman in London, a woman who, on the surface, had no connection to Summer. But she did have a connection to Hunter. Detectives wasted no time tracking down everything they could about Lucy. She was in her late 20s, worked in IT, and had been active in an online gaming community for years. That was where the connection had formed, between her and Hunter, between two people who had never met in person, but had spent hours talking, playing, messaging. Investigators uncovered logs from gaming chats, private messages exchanged between the two. They weren't just casual conversations. They were intimate. Hunter hadn't just been playing games. He had been building a life in a world where his wife didn't exist. The messages started innocently enough, jokes, shared interests, late-night gaming sessions that stretched into the early hours. But they evolved. Lucy had told Hunter about her life, her job, her relationships. He had confided in her too, but his stories were different. He painted a picture of a marriage that was falling apart, of a wife who didn't understand him, of a life that felt like a prison. It was a narrative designed to create sympathy, and it had worked. The conversations grew darker in the weeks leading up to Summer's disappearance. Hunter spoke about feeling trapped, about wanting a fresh start, about how things would be easier if certain problems just went away. And then there was the most chilling message of all, sent 4 days before Summer vanished. "I think I found a way out." Investigators stared at the screen, reading the words over and over, the weight of them sinking in. They were vague enough to be dismissed as meaningless to someone who wasn't looking for signs, but in the context of everything else, the bleach-scrubbed floors, the missing suitcase that had never been packed, the sudden silence of Summer's phone, it was impossible to ignore. They needed to talk to Lucy. A request was sent to authorities in London, and within hours a detective was knocking on her door. She answered, confused at first, unaware that her name had been dragged into a criminal investigation happening thousands of miles away. But when she was shown the messages, the reality set in. She hadn't known Summer was missing. She hadn't thought twice about Hunter's words at the time. It had just been late-night venting, or so she had assumed. But the more they pressed, the more they uncovered. Hunter had sent her money. Not a large amount, but enough to raise questions. Enough to suggest that this wasn't just a meaningless online affair, but something more calculated. He had asked her to book a ticket under her name, a one-way flight to London. He had said it was a precaution. He had told her that if anything went wrong, he might need a place to stay. That was the moment Lucy realized she had been part of something she hadn't fully understood. Meanwhile, back in Alabama, forensic teams were still searching the Tatum property. The cadaver dog that had alerted near the shed had given them a direction, but no body had been found. That didn't mean nothing had been there. It only meant that whatever had happened had been covered up well. But then a new lead surfaced, security footage from a gas station 6 miles from the Tatum home. At 3:47 a.m., the night Summer disappeared, a car had pulled into the station. Hunter's car. He hadn't gone inside. He had just sat there for nearly 10 minutes, engine running, staring at the dashboard before finally getting out. The footage wasn't clear enough to see what he was doing at first, but then after zooming in, investigators noticed something small but crucial. He was holding a garbage bag, a single dark plastic bag, which he tossed into the station's dumpster before driving away. It wasn't much, but it was something. A team was sent to retrieve it, sifting through piles of trash, digging past discarded receipts, food wrappers, coffee cups. When they found the bag, it had already been compressed under other waste, but inside there were clothes. Not just any clothes, Summer's clothes, a pair of maternity leggings, a t-shirt, underwear. All of them stained, not blood, bleach, the same scent that had clung to the air in the house. The pieces were coming together faster now, and Hunter was running out of places to hide. The search warrant had already uncovered inconsistencies in his timeline. His phone records placed him near that gas station at the exact time the footage showed his car. His conversation with Lucy had set a foundation for premeditation. The evidence was circumstantial, but when woven together, it painted a picture that was becoming harder and harder to ignore. Reynolds sat back in his chair at the station, flipping through the pages of reports, of statements, of mounting proof that whatever had happened to Summer Tatum hadn't been an accident, hadn't been a misunderstanding, hadn't been a woman walking away from her life. It had been deliberate. It had been planned. But there was still one thing missing: a body. And without that, the case wasn't complete. Not yet. The weight of the investigation had shifted. What had started as a missing persons case had evolved into something far more sinister, something calculated, something that couldn't be dismissed as a misunderstanding or an impulsive departure. The discovery of Summer Tatum's bleach-stained clothing in the gas station dumpster had tied Hunter to the disposal of evidence. But without a body, it wasn't enough to close the case. Investigators had built a puzzle with missing pieces, but the image was clear enough to see the truth. Summer hadn't left on her own. Detectives spent the following days piecing together the movements of Hunter Tatum on the night his wife vanished. Surveillance footage from local businesses provided glimpses of his car traveling through town at odd hours. His usual routines disrupted. Traffic cameras caught him heading toward rural areas outside Prattville, places with dense woods, empty lots, and long stretches of road where no one would be watching. He had been out for hours, his route erratic, doubling back in some areas, slowing down in others. It wasn't the drive of a man running an errand. It was the drive of someone looking for a place to disappear something, or someone. The burner phone he had used at 3:12 a.m. was another loose thread. Investigators pulled cell tower data, tracking pings that suggested the phone had only been active for a short period before being shut off permanently. Its location placed it near a desolate stretch of highway, a road leading out of town, one that connected to areas where the land was nothing but trees, open fields, and abandoned structures. Teams were dispatched to search these locations, cadaver dogs leading the way, their handlers moving in silence as they navigated through thick underbrush, abandoned farmhouses, and stretches of land that hadn't been disturbed in years. The first day yielded nothing. The second day, the same. But then, on the third day, a breakthrough. A farmer reported something unusual near the edge of his property. Disturbed earth, a patch of ground that looked like it had been dug up recently and covered again. It was just beyond his land, close enough to notice but not enough to make him immediately suspicious. It wasn't the kind of place where people went hiking, not the kind of place where someone would have a reason to dig. The search team moved in, the air thick with the weight of what they might find. The ground was soft, the soil recently turned. They worked quickly, shovels breaking through the dirt, uncovering layers that had been carefully pressed down to hide whatever lay beneath. It didn't take long before they found what they had been looking for: a human body, or what remained of one, wrapped in a tarp, buried shallowly, as if the person who had placed it there had been in a hurry, had been looking over their shoulder the entire time, had been racing against the rising sun. The decomposition had begun, but there was no mistaking the identity. Summer Tatum had been found. News traveled fast, reaching the station before the body had even been fully recovered. Reynolds stood in the briefing room, staring at the call log as the update came through. It was the confirmation they had needed, the final, undeniable piece of evidence that turned suspicion into certainty. They didn't wait. Hunter Tatum was taken into custody that evening, his expression unreadable as he was placed in handcuffs and escorted into a police cruiser. He didn't ask why. He didn't fight. He didn't say a word. But it was over. The case was no longer about whether or not he had done it. It was about proving why. Hunter Tatum sat in the interrogation room, his wrists bound in handcuffs, his eyes locked on the dull metal table in front of him. The air in the room was heavy, not with the weight of the crime itself, that had already been proven, but with the silence that followed. He had barely spoken since his arrest, only offering short, measured responses when necessary. He hadn't asked for details about the charges. He hadn't denied anything. He hadn't even asked for a lawyer, at least not yet. Outside the room, detectives reviewed the evidence, laying it out in a meticulous timeline that left little room for ambiguity. The forensic analysis of Summer's body was still underway, but preliminary findings were already confirming what they suspected. She had been shot, twice. The trajectory suggested that she had been sitting or kneeling when it happened, a chilling detail that painted a scene more intimate than a crime of passion, more controlled than a spontaneous outburst. It was execution style. The autopsy also revealed another devastating truth. The baby, still growing inside her, had never stood a chance. The crime was no longer just the murder of one person, but two. The forensic team continued analyzing the traces of blood found in the house, cross-referencing them with Summer's DNA, confirming the exact locations where the attack had likely taken place. The bedroom carpet had absorbed more than what was visible to the naked eye, and beneath the fabric, they found deeper saturation, proof that an attempt had been made to clean the scene before her body was moved. The evidence was undeniable. Summer had died in that house, and everything that followed had been a calculated effort to erase the truth. But it was the digital trail that cemented the case. Investigators combed through Hunter's online activity, uncovering his late-night searches, his encrypted messages, his deleted logs. The conversations with Lucy Gardner took on a darker tone when paired with the reality of what had happened. It wasn't just harmless venting. It was preparation. It was justification. It was the slow unraveling of a man convincing himself that there was only one way out. The most damning piece of digital evidence came in the form of a deleted file recovered from Hunter's personal laptop, an unsent email draft written the night before Summer disappeared. By the time you read this, things will be different. I just need to start over. I can't do this anymore. I know it's wrong, but it's the only way. It had been wiped from his system, erased as if the thought had flickered in his mind for a moment before he decided he didn't need to send it. But the fact that he had typed it at all was enough. When investigators confronted Lucy Gardner with the full scope of Hunter's actions, her initial shock gave way to something closer to horror. She had known him as a friend, a confidant, someone she had felt sorry for when he talked about his failing marriage. She had believed his words, the way he framed himself as a victim, the way he made it seem like his wife was a force keeping him trapped in a life he didn't want. But she hadn't known. She hadn't believed even for a second that he was capable of this. Lucy agreed to cooperate, handing over everything: messages, call logs, transactions. It all built a case so solid that there was no space left for doubt. In the end, the only missing piece was Hunter's confession, but he wasn't offering one. As the hours stretched on in the interrogation room, he remained still, occasionally shifting in his chair, but never speaking first. He listened as detectives laid out the evidence, detailing every mistake he had made, every miscalculation, every step that had led them straight to him. His expression remained unreadable. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, and then finally he exhaled. "I didn't mean for it to happen that way." The words were quiet, barely audible, but they carried the weight of everything that had been hidden. It wasn't a confession, not entirely, but it was the first crack in the wall he had built around himself. The unraveling had begun. The moment the words left Hunter Tatum's mouth, the room seemed to change. The detectives didn't react immediately, didn't push, didn't let their expressions reveal the significance of what had just happened. Instead, they let the silence stretch between them, letting him sit in the weight of his own admission, letting him feel the inevitability of where this was headed. "I didn't mean for it to happen that way." It wasn't an outright confession, but it was more than he had given before. It was an acknowledgement, a fracture in his carefully rehearsed defense, a moment where his control slipped just enough for the truth to edge closer to the surface. Outside the interrogation room, investigators were finalizing the case against him. The forensic evidence was damning, the digital records irrefutable, the surveillance footage tightening the noose around his alibi. Every step he had taken after Summer's death had been a calculated attempt to erase the crime. But with each decision, he had left behind traces, subtle, seemingly insignificant mistakes that, when pieced together, formed an undeniable timeline of guilt. The trajectory of the bullets told a story of control, not chaos. The bleach-stained clothes in the dumpster told a story of a deliberate cover-up. The missing suitcase, the wiped search history, the call to a burner phone. Each of these pieces fit into the narrative of a man who hadn't acted in the heat of the moment, but had planned, premeditated, ensured that when the night ended, he would be the only one left standing. But the prosecution wanted more. They wanted his voice on record, not just the forensic evidence, not just the digital breadcrumbs, but the spoken admission that would seal his fate. The interrogation stretched on, deliberate and methodical, unraveling Hunter's defenses layer by layer. The detectives laid out everything they had, showing him the evidence in sequence, letting him see how every attempt to cover his tracks had ultimately led them back to him. They presented his online conversations with Lucy Gardner, reading aloud the messages where he painted himself as a victim, where he spoke about needing an escape, where he hinted again and again that he had a way out. They showed him the surveillance footage from the gas station, slowing down the frames, making him watch as his own car sat idling for minutes before he emerged with a trash bag, before he tossed it away like an afterthought. They played back the pings from his burner phone, matching them with the areas where his car had been seen, where the cadaver dogs had signaled, where Summer's body had ultimately been found. They presented the autopsy report, detailing the exact moment her life had ended, the certainty with which the bullets had been fired, the lack of struggle, the way she had been kneeling when the first shot was fired. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a moment of rage. It was execution. Hunter sat there, his jaw clenched, his fingers twitching against the table. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to refute the evidence. He just listened, absorbing every piece of the case that had been built against him, watching as the door to any escape route he might have imagined slowly closed around him. And then they pushed harder. They brought up Summer's baby, the child who had never taken a breath outside of her mother's womb, the child whose death had been an unavoidable consequence of Hunter's actions. They described in detail how the medical examiner had determined that the baby had been perfectly healthy, how, had Summer been given the chance, she would have given birth to a child who was already fully formed, already developed, already a person waiting to exist. For the first time since his arrest, something flickered across Hunter's face, something unreadable, something raw. It was guilt. He exhaled, leaning forward slightly, rubbing his hands together as if trying to erase something unseen from his palms. It wasn't supposed to be like that, he said again, softer this time. The detectives didn't interrupt. They let him keep talking. I just wanted her to stop, he continued, his voice hoarse, drained. She wouldn't let it go. She wouldn't stop looking through my things, asking questions, pushing. I told her I needed space. I told her I didn't want this anymore. His words slowed, and for the first time he looked up, locking eyes with the lead detective. She said she was going to leave, he admitted. She said she was going to take the baby and go. Silence filled the room. That was it. That was the motive. Not an impulsive fight, not an accident, but control, the need to win, the need to make sure that when Summer walked away, she didn't take anything with her. Not their marriage, not their shared life, not their child. It had never been about escaping a broken relationship. It had been about making sure she couldn't leave him first. The confession, even in its fragmented form, was enough. Hunter Tatum was officially charged with the murder of Summer Tatum and their unborn child. The case was no longer about proving his guilt. It was about justice, and justice was coming. The trial of Hunter Tatum began under the weight of unshakable evidence, the kind that left no room for doubt, no space for uncertainty. By the time the courtroom doors opened, the public already knew what had been found, what had been uncovered, how the web of deception had unraveled to reveal the brutal truth. The prosecution was not just seeking justice for Summer Tatum, but for the unborn child who had never been given a chance to live. The weight of 2 lives sat on the shoulders of 12 jurors, each of whom would decide whether Hunter Tatum would ever walk free again. Inside the courtroom, Summer's family filled the rows, their presence a quiet but overwhelming reminder of who had been lost. Her mother, Diane, sat with her hands clasped together, knuckles white, eyes locked on the man who had once been her son-in-law, the man who had shared holidays at her dinner table, the man who had promised to love her daughter, the man who had destroyed everything. She had waited for this moment, for the trial to begin, for the world to hear exactly what had happened on the night Summer Tatum took her last breath. The prosecution laid out the case with surgical precision. They walked the jury through the timeline, through every lie, every deception, every misstep that had led them to this moment. They showed the security footage of Hunter's car at the gas station, his silhouette barely visible as he discarded the bag filled with Summer's bleach-stained clothing. They pulled up the forensic reports, detailing how the blood traces in the house had been wiped but not entirely erased, how the luminol revealed the truth that soap and bleach had tried to conceal. They presented the digital evidence, the messages exchanged between Hunter and Lucy Gardner, the deleted search history recovered from his laptop, the unsent email draft where he had practically written his own confession before deciding against it. And then they showed the final, irrefutable piece of evidence, the footage of Hunter himself sitting in an interrogation room, his own voice betraying him. "I didn't mean for it to happen that way," he had said, and in those words the jury heard not innocence, not remorse, but confirmation. The defense did what they could. They attempted to frame the crime as an act of desperation rather than premeditation. They tried to paint Hunter as a man who had reached his breaking point, overwhelmed by a failing marriage, by financial strain, by the impending responsibilities of fatherhood. They suggested that he had acted impulsively, that he had panicked, that the killing had not been planned, but had been a tragic, momentary lapse in control. But the evidence did not support that narrative. The messages to Lucy Gardner, the research on methods of cleaning crime scenes, the burner phone purchased in secret, all of it spoke to intent, to forethought, to a man who had not acted in the heat of the moment, but had crafted his own escape plan and executed it with precision. The prosecution did not need to argue that Hunter had lost control. They needed only to show that he had never intended to let Summer walk away in the first place. And then came the testimonies. Lauren Adams, Summer's best friend, took the stand, her voice steady but edged with grief as she described the last time she had spoken to Summer, how excited she had been for dinner, how the final text message she received, "Not feeling well, maybe another time," had felt wrong, unnatural. Summer's mother followed, her composure unshaken but her pain evident in every word as she spoke about the day she had stepped into the house and smelled the bleach, how she had looked at Hunter and known in that instant that something was horribly, irreversibly wrong. And finally, the medical examiner, who laid out the chilling reality in the most clinical terms possible. Summer Tatum had been shot execution style. She had been kneeling. She had not fought back. She had been killed with precision, not in a fit of rage, but in a controlled act of violence. And in taking her life, Hunter had also taken the life of their child. By the time closing arguments were made, there was no question about what had happened. There was only the question of what would happen next. The jury deliberated for just over 5 hours. When they returned to the courtroom, the four persons stood, hands trembling slightly as they prepared to deliver the verdict. The room was silent, every breath held in anticipation, every gaze locked on the 12 strangers who now held the fate of a murderer in their hands. Guilty, on all counts. A heavy exhale passed through the room, not relief, not satisfaction, but something closer to finality. Hunter Tatum sat motionless as the words settled, as the reality of what had just happened finally landed. There would be no bargaining, no reduced sentence, no possibility of freedom. The judge wasted no time. Hunter Tatum was sentenced to 2 consecutive 99-year prison terms, one for Summer, one for the unborn child whose heartbeat had never been given the chance to grow. He would spend the rest of his life in a cell, a reality that he had tried to avoid, but had ultimately built for himself. The trial ended, but the grief did not. Summer's family left the courthouse knowing that justice had been served, but not feeling any lighter for it. Justice did not bring her back. Justice did not fill the empty space at the dinner table, did not undo the nightmare they had lived through, did not replace the life that had been taken. Justice only closed the door on the past, leaving them to walk forward into a future that felt colder, quieter, emptier. Lucy Gardner disappeared from the public eye, her name forever tied to a crime she had unknowingly been connected to. She had never set foot in Alabama, had never spoken to Summer, had never held the gun or buried the body, but she had been there in the background, a witness to the unraveling of a man who had convinced himself that his only way out was through the destruction of another life. She carried that knowledge with her, a permanent scar. And Hunter, he faded from the headlines, his name becoming just another in the long list of men who had taken the lives of women they claimed to love. He was no longer the center of attention, no longer in control of the narrative. He was just an inmate now, a number, another prisoner serving out a sentence that stretched beyond his lifetime. But Summer, her name did not fade. In the years that followed, her story remained. Not as a tragedy, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder of who she had been before Hunter tried to erase her. She was more than the crime that had taken her life. She was a daughter, a friend, a mother who never got to meet her child, a woman whose light had been dim but not forgotten. And in the end, it was her story, not his, that lived on. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.